All right, greetings, friends, and welcome to week 2. This is going to be lecture 2. Over the course of the next 2 lectures, I'm going to be diving into some content that is going to be familiar to some, kind of familiar to others, and incredibly unfamiliar to some of us. And as I engage this content, I want to be sensitive to the range of exposure we've had to philosophical and theological ideas. So what I want you to get from these next couple lectures is what you can. Like, the future of where we go from here in this course is not dependent upon these 2 lectures. And yet I think it provides a backdrop or a content or a framework for us to understand how we've arrived at where we are currently in trying to make sense of complexity. That's why I had you read the article. The article you may have found to be a challenge, but I think the article, again, introduces us to language and ideas that make us realize that what we're feeling is not because we're crazy, but because something has significantly shifted. Even if we couldn't put our finger on it, even if we couldn't identify what exactly had shifted around us, something is different. So if you're following along in the PowerPoint, you'll see a PowerPoint slide that starts with why the world feels so much different than it once was. And I think for us to understand the reason why it feels different is literally because it is. And I want to make this statement too. Our perception of reality, how we organize reality, how we make sense of reality, is deeply embedded in the cosmological constructs of the times in which we live. Meaning, we make sense of the cosmos in certain ways, in certain times, and in certain contexts. And the ways in which we organize the concepts of the cosmos, the world around us, physics, nature, science, relationships, community, all of those things, all of the organizing principles, the ways in which our time, in our place, and in our context understands cosmological realities, shapes our perception of our experience of reality, and for the sake of ministry and theology, our practice of ministry and our articulation of theology. So how we understand reality is deeply embedded in the cosmological constructs of the times in which we've lived. And those cosmological constructs have not remained steady and remained the same throughout the centuries. They're not even steady and the same in the centuries of the early church either. And I think that's important for us to realize. Is that the early church shifted from a Hebraic mindset. And there was a cosmological way of understanding the universe for the Hebrews that was significantly different than the Greco-Roman world, this Gentile world that they're entering into. So I'll give you an example. Within the cosmological construct of the Hebrew world, the human was a monad, meaning this, that our spirit, our body, our emotional, physical side, those are all tied together. You couldn't be something spiritually and be something else physically because we are monad. Those are tied intimately together. My spiritual affects my physical, affects my mental, affects my emotional. Those are all tied together. When the word of Christ went out into the Gentile world, the cosmological construct of the human being was triad. Mind, body, spirit, right? And so Paul literally has to interpret on the fly, given a new construct that they were experiencing. Now, what was similar between the Hebrews and the Greeks and the Romans is that in pre-modernity, which is, and I'll tell you, so pre-modernity, let's say everything before 1500 AD, pre-modernity, there was an assumption made that the world was enchanted. And by that I mean the assumption was God, right? Or gods, or something transcendent, depending upon where you were. There was a transcendent ordering principle in the cosmos there was an assumption that there was something beyond us. And that's often how I refer to transcendence. There was a beyond usness, right? That there was something more than what we can see, feel, or experience physically in this world. There was something transcendent. Now, that transcendence was rooted in a variety of different ways, and I'm thankful for Walter Wink in the work that he has done in his talking about worldviews and the powers and principalities, because he talks about transcendence within really three different ways. One is the mirroring effect, that what is on earth has a mirrored effect in heaven, or I should really reverse that. What is in heaven has a mirrored effect as to what is on earth. So this is kind of this idea of Platonic philosophy, that the what is materially, or what is on the earth, is an imperfect resemblance of what it is, the perfect form in the heavens. And so we can think about even how the Hebrews built their temple and their tabernacle, believing that it somehow mirrored the heavenly throne room, right? This idea that there's a connectedness there. There's another way of looking at transcendence in the pre-modern world, which is this idea of cosmic dualism, which is there's a good and an evil, right? There's two forces that are battling each other, and those two forces are vying for which is going to be victorious and how they're going to be victorious. And the third one is what we would say the corruption of the material world. So this would be Gnosticism. So the material world is inherently bad, and we need to throw off the chains of the physical so that we can get somewhere else to the spiritual. But all of them really sort of assume this idea of transcendence or God or godness. And there was an order to the world because God had ordered the world. And that ordering of the world operated by divine mandate. And so if we operate under this assumption that what is in heaven is mirrored on earth, then the heavenly rulership of God is located in the earthly rulership of powers and principalities and the authorities that are over us, and the ways in which they establish their leadership and reign in the world is reflective of the will of God that is mirrored up in the heavens. And so what this means is this early church that was on the periphery, this marginalized group of people that operated out of this Jewish mindset, moved into this Gentile world and were trying to stake their claim and assert the authority and lordship of Jesus in a world that had declared that there's another form of authority and rulership, which is that of Caesar and Rome. And it's not until about 312 that this peripheral marginal group of people called Christians is co-opted by the empire. And they're brought into and established as the authoritative religion. And what I want to talk to you just briefly on here is the way in which that shapes the mission of the church. Is that if we operate under the assumptions of the enchantment of the world, that God and gods are at work in the world, and that God has ordered the world to exist in a certain way, if the church then is brought within that order, it's also given a form of power. And so mission is about the extension of power into new places and new lands to create belief, right? And that power is often rooted in its embeddedness in political constructs. And so it leads to this sort of imperialist mission of taking ground in the name of God, according to the will of God, so that people can believe in the community or participate in the community that is in the right side of God's justice and rightness in the world. And so everything is ordered based upon God's will, God's design, God's purposes, and we needed to be on the right side of God. And that was the assumption of pre-modernity. Well, what we find towards the end of pre-modernity is that everybody's fighting about whether or not they're on the right side of God, what God's will is, what this imperialistic force and this impositional mission of Christianity is. And there's a shift that begins to happen because the question becomes, can we root the mission of God? Can we root our understanding of truth in this pre-modern mindset? Or is there a different way of seeing the world and recognizing the way in which the world works? This gives way to what we call modernity. So I just gave you a lot of philosophy, and it's inadequate, and it's substandard, and it's shallow. But what I wanted us to understand is that the early church was born in a pre-modern mindset that assumed some things cosmologically about the world. that then the world shifts in modernity. There's a new cosmological construct that the church, and ultimately the evangelical church, is going to be born within. And we need to be paying attention to those cosmological changes. So in the next lecture, I'm going to pick up that cosmological construct and change that happens within modernity.